He walked onto the stage to share his truth and walked off in handcuffs. In front of 15 million viewers, Keanu Reeves was silenced, humiliated, and nearly erased on live television. But what no one knew is that every second of that takedown was part of his plan. So what was he really after? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It started with an email that looked like any other. Clean subject line, no urgency, just the words. An invitation to speak. The sender was Bill Maher's production team. The tone was respectful, even flattering. They were inviting Keanu Reeves to appear on an upcoming episode of the show. Not as a movie star, not to promote a project, but for what they described as a deep, unfiltered conversation about truth, influence, and the role of public figures in modern Disney. Keanu read it once, then again. It wasn't the kind of thing he usually accepted. For years, he had politely declined most television interviews, especially ones that leaned political or sensational. He knew how quickly a well-meaning conversation could turn into a headline. But this one, something about it pulled at him. Maybe it was the word truth. Maybe it was the moment. He forwarded the email to Amelia Hart, his longtime attorney and closest advisor, with just 2 words: thoughts. An hour later, she called. "Keanu," she said, "you know who this is coming from, right?" "I do." He's not exactly neutral, and his show isn't known for playing fair. "I know," Keanu replied, quietly. There was a pause on the line. Then why even consider it? Keanu leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in warm amber. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "Because people aren't listening to each other anymore. Everyone's performing. Maybe if I walk into the fire, someone watching will see what it really is." Amelia exhaled. "You're not just walking into the fire, Keanu. You're walking into a setup. You know that, right?" "I do," he said again. "That's why I won't go in unprepared." There was a shift in his voice, measured, calm, but with an edge Amelia hadn't heard in years. He wasn't just reacting. He was already thinking 2 steps ahead. "If I agree to this," he added, "I want everything documented. Every second, from the ride to the studio to the moment I leave that stage." Amelia didn't argue. She knew better than to push when Keanu spoke like that. His kindness often masked a fierce intuition, and something told her that this invitation, this innocuous little email, was more than it seemed. She made the arrangements, but she also began making calls of her own. A legal observer, a court clerk on standby, a document prepared in advance, just in case. Because while Keanu agreed to appear calm on the surface, neither of them were willing to go in blind. Not this time. The following morning, Keanu's team gathered in his quiet home office. Amelia had called in 2 additional people, his media strategist, Jordan Lyles, and a private security consultant named Sam Vega. The room was still, filled with the quiet tension that often precedes major decisions. Everyone knew this wasn't about promoting a film. This was about principles and the risk of stepping into a space designed not for dialogue, but spectacle. Amelia opened her laptop. The studio confirmed the date. They're calling it an open segment, meaning Bill can go in any direction. No pre-interview, no shared questions. Jordan shifted in his chair, which means they're baiting you. They want unpredictability because it makes for better clips. Keanu nodded once. "Let them clip. I'll stay whole." Jordan glanced at Amelia, who offered no counterpoint. Then Sam spoke up. "We've scanned the crew list. No red flags. But it's worth noting they're bringing in a new security team that night. Outsourced, not the usual guys." Keanu looked at him calmly. "You think that's about me?" Sam hesitated. "I think they're planning something bigger than a difficult conversation." Keanu didn't flinch. So we planned something bigger than a reaction. He stood and paced slowly to the window. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The air felt heavy, even peaceful. But inside, he felt a quiet storm gathering. Not of fear, but of clarity. For months, he'd watched as voices were silenced in the name of safety, as people lost their platforms, not for lies, but for questions. And through it all, he remained quiet. Until now. He turned back to the room. We're not trying to win a debate. We're preparing for exposure. If they try to twist the truth, we uncoil the whole machine. Jordan raised an eyebrow. You're saying, let them come for you? No, Keanu replied, his tone firm. I'm saying, let them think they already have. Amelia opened a folder and pulled out a document. I've drafted a federal stay under First Amendment protection, Section 341C. If they attempt to silence or remove you without legal basis, we present it. It'll be time-stamped and uploaded 6 hours before the show. Keanu nodded. Good. She glanced at him. If it comes to that, if they escalate, are you ready? Keanu's voice was quiet, but resolute. I'm not going there to fight. I'm going there to be seen. If they make it a fight, then they've already lost. There was no more debate. The room fell still again. This time, not with worry, but resolve. The invitation had been accepted. But it was never just about words. It was about what happens when the wrong people try to silence the right one. The next 48 hours were quiet, deliberate. Every step was calculated with the kind of precision that didn't draw attention but ensured there'd be no surprises Keanu hadn't already considered. While the studio was preparing lights and cameras, Keanu's team was preparing truth and leverage. At Amelia's direction, a neutral, third-party legal observer was flown in and quietly credentialed as a technical consultant for the night of the broadcast. She wouldn't sit in the spotlight or speak on air. She was there for one reason only, to witness what others might try to hide. Meanwhile, Keanu made a personal request, something his team didn't expect. He asked to sit alone with a pen and notebook. For 2 hours, he wrote in silence. When Amelia entered the room later, he handed her the pages. This is my record, he said simply. She read it quickly. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't legal jargon. It was personal. It was perspective. A written testament of what he believed freedom meant. The kind of thing that, if things went wrong, could be released later, not as an attack, but as a reminder. Amelia folded the pages and placed them in a sealed envelope. We'll call it the contingency. Keanu gave a small smile. It's not for them. It's for whoever comes after. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Keanu walked alone outside, hands in his pockets. No cameras, no audience, just the quiet before the storm. His steps were slow, thoughtful, grounded. Because this wasn't about fame. This wasn't about being right. This was about what it means to keep your voice when the world around you is built to take it. The invitation had come wrapped in civility, in promises of open dialogue and mutual respect. But Keanu knew better. He knew that beneath the surface of polite framing, something more dangerous lurked. Something engineered to fracture trust and punish dissent. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but he wasn't going to feed it either. Instead, he'd walk into that studio like he walked through life, with steady silence, calm eyes, and the full weight of truth resting in his pocket. And before the night was over, they'd all learn something that couldn't be cut or edited out. Silence is not submission. It's strategy. And sometimes, the loudest voice in the room is the one that waits closes. Before speaking at all, the stage was being set. The curtain would soon rise. But this time, Keanu wasn't the one performing. And they didn't even know it yet. The black SUV pulled quietly into the private lot behind the studio. No flashing lights, no public fanfare, just a calm arrival, deliberately quiet. Keanu Reeves stepped out, dressed in a dark charcoal suit and soft leather boots. No entourage, no rush. Only Amelia Hart, walking a few steps behind him, tablet in hand, eyes scanning everything. The building itself looked ordinary, a standard studio lot, tall concrete walls, a row of trailers and crew members carrying clipboards and walkie-talkies. But the atmosphere felt different. Manufactured, too polished, too coordinated. A man in a headset approached, smiling wide. "Mr. Reeves, welcome. We're so honored to have you with us. The green room's prepped. Mr. Maher's looking forward to a great conversation." Keanu nodded once, no smile, but not cold either, just present, steady. They were led down a hallway with spotless white floors and framed posters of past shows. The walls echoed with the quiet thrum of energy, the kind that builds before a storm. Camera operators shuffled past. A lighting tech gave a forced smile. Each person who greeted Keanu seemed friendly but rehearsed, as if they were reading from a script no one had shared with him. As they neared the green room, Amelia leaned in slightly. "Too clean," she murmured. Keanu responded without looking. "It's not what they say, Amelia. It's what they avoid saying." Inside the green room, the lights were warm and the furniture soft. Bottled water, a fruit tray, and printed cards with Keanu's name were set on the coffee table. Every detail was perfect. Then Bill Maher walked in. He wore a relaxed smile and extended a hand. "Keanu, it's really good of you to come." Keanu shook it lightly. "Thanks for the invitation." Bill sat across from him, legs crossed, hands clasped. "You know, I've always admired your calm. Even when the world's loud, you never flinch." Keanu just nodded. "There's not much to gain from flinching." Bill chuckled. "Well, tonight's not about flinching. It's about clarity, real talk." His tone was friendly, even warm, but something in his eyes gave him away. Keanu could see the pacing behind the politeness, the way his gaze darted, not quite locking in. He wasn't here for clarity. He was here for control. "I just want an open conversation," Bill continued. "No gotchas, no games, just truth." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Sounds good." But in that moment he knew this wasn't truth. It was choreography. Amelia stood near the doorway, arms loosely folded, but her eyes missed nothing. While the conversation between Keanu and Bill continued with surface-level charm, she watched the subtle choreography behind the scenes. A producer walked by and gave a courteous nod, then leaned into his headset a moment too quickly. A grip checked the studio door handle twice, as if testing timing. Nothing looked out of place, yet everything felt staged. When Bill excused himself for a final prep meeting, Keanu remained seated, eyes steady. He didn't speak until the door shut behind the host. "You feel it too?" he asked, softly. Amelia nodded. "The green room's wired. I counted 4 mics and 2 concealed cameras, not including the obvious one. They're monitoring pre-show demeanor, probably looking for something they can clip or twist." Keanu didn't react with outrage, just calm recognition. "Good. Let them watch." Amelia stepped forward and handed him a small lapel mic, not the one issued by the studio. "It's live, encrypted, and backed up to a local server off-site. Starts rolling the second you walk out there." Keanu took it without a word and pinned it just beneath the fold of his jacket collar. Then came the final precaution. From her inside coat pocket, Amelia withdrew a small, sleek USB drive. She handed it to a young technician dressed in black, who had entered quietly moments before. The man took it, said nothing, and moved toward the control booth. It wasn't a hack or a breach. It was a scheduled transfer, one the studio had agreed to under the vague label of backup segment footage. What they didn't realize was that the drive contained time-locked legal documentation, tied to federal protections. A digital contingency loaded 6 hours earlier into the judicial filing system and verified by 2 independent notaries. Amelia turned back to Keanu, her voice low. "Everything's in motion. Even if they try something off-script, we're ahead of it." Keanu nodded. They think the show starts when the lights go on. Amelia gave him a half smile. But it started the moment you said yes. A soft knock came on the door. A crew member peeked in. 2 minutes to walk out. Keanu stood slowly, adjusted the sleeves of his blazer and looked at his reflection in the glass of the cabinet across the room. He looked tired. Not from worry, but from watching the world twist too long in silence. This time, he wasn't going to twist with it. He turned and headed toward the stage. The hallway leading to the stage was dim, quiet, and padded with soft soundproofing. Each step Keanu took echoed in his mind more than in the air. He was flanked by 2 stage managers, both overly friendly, their movements too tight, too exact. One kept glancing at the clock on the wall. The other repeatedly tapped his earpiece as if waiting for some cue. Keanu walked slowly, his posture upright, movements deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. But he didn't retreat either. There was no fear, only focus. Just before reaching the curtains, he paused. Amelia caught up, standing off to the side behind a black curtain. She whispered, "Mic check?" "Your feed is clear. Audio is stable. Visuals synced with 3 external backups." Keanu looked at her, then gave a simple nod. "What happens now is theirs to start," he said, "but ours to finish." A stage assistant peeked through the curtain and gave the signal. "Going live in 5, 4. The crowd noise swelled behind the barrier, clapping, a few cheers. Studio lights flickered on overhead, casting beams of white-hot attention into the room. 3, 2. The curtain opened. Keanu stepped into the light. Applause rippled across the studio. Not a standing ovation, just polite, curious clapping. The audience didn't know what to expect, only that tonight's episode had been advertised as a can't-miss live conversation. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every movement, every blink. The stage was sleek, modern. 2 armchairs, a glass table, a large LED screen behind them. Bill Maher was already seated, his body turned slightly, smiling as Keanu approached. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing with performative excitement, "please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves." Keanu walked to his chair without looking at the cameras. He shook Bill's hand again, firm, steady, and sat down. Bill launched right in. "You know, Keanu, it's funny. People call you the most mysterious man in Hollywood, but here you are, live, unscripted, unguarded. That alone's worth a round of applause." Laughter scattered through the audience. Keanu gave a brief, acknowledging nod, but didn't engage with the energy. He was present, but not performative. Bill continued. "So, let's get into it. I want to talk about the world, about truth, about storytelling, and about why you've been so quiet. You've seen what's happening. People afraid to speak, afraid to question, but also people saying things that get others hurt. Where do we draw the line?" Keanu's eyes never wavered. "We start by asking who gets to draw it." Bill raised an eyebrow. "Okay, I like that. Already philosophical." The crowd chuckled again, but there was a subtle tension building. The kind of tension that comes when you sense something else is happening just beneath the surface. Amelia, from behind the curtain, watched the exchange like a chess match. The file had been delivered. The real Mike was live. The legal observer was seated in the back row, posing as a studio guest. Every contingency was in place. Keanu leaned back, legs crossed, posture loose, but his presence was anything but casual. He had accepted their invitation, but the moment he sat in that chair, the show was no longer theirs. It belonged to the truth, and it had just taken its seat. The opening minutes of the broadcast played like any other late-night segment. The audience laughed in all the right places, the lights were warm, the air had that rehearsed ease of a well-oiled production. Bill Maher leaned back in his chair with a knowing grin. "So, Keanu, we've all heard the stories. You give up your seat on the subway, You write handwritten notes to stunt crews. You donate your movie salaries to hospitals. Are you trying to make the rest of us look bad?" The audience chuckled. Keanu smiled softly. "No, I'm just trying to not make things worse." Bill laughed again. "You see? This is why people love you. You're not loud, but somehow you say more than most people shouting." Keanu didn't respond with a joke. He simply nodded. They moved through the motions. Bill asked about motorcycles, and Keanu shared a story about building one from scrap with a friend. He spoke about the open road, how it made him feel grounded. When asked about fame, he deflected gently. "It's never been about the camera. It's always been about the connection." And the audience listened, smiling, leaning in. Then the tone shifted. Bill straightened up in his chair. "Let's pivot a bit," he said, glancing at the cue card in his hand. "You've made some recent comments in interviews about freedom, about the soul, about, and I quote, the danger of systems that reward silence more than sincerity." Keanu nodded. Bill looked directly at him. "Some people say that kind of talk borders on conspiracy, that it encourages distrust, or worse, reckless thinking. What do you say to those who think you're promoting something dangerous?" The audience didn't laugh this time. A few faces turned serious. One woman crossed her arms. Keanu didn't blink. "I say they're scared." Bill tilted his head. "Of what?" Keanu replied, voice steady. "Of what happens when people start asking their own questions instead of repeating answers they were taught to memorize. We live in a time where silence is rewarded and doubt is punished. But doubt isn't dangerous, it's human. It's the beginning of clarity." A few audience members nodded. One man in the front row whispered something to the woman beside him. Bill didn't flinch. "But isn't that just another way of justifying chaos? If everyone questions everything, how does anything hold together?" Keanu turned toward him, still calm. "Respectful disagreement isn't chaos. It's democracy." The room was quieter now. Bill opened his mouth to respond, but in that moment something changed. A faint static buzzed through the speakers. The lights didn't flicker, the cameras didn't cut, but the mic, Keanu's mic, began to crackle. Then came the banner on the screen. "Technical difficulties, please stand by." The buzz wasn't loud, but it was sharp. An unnatural ripple that made every ear in the studio twitch. Keanu paused mid-sentence, instinctively reaching toward the small mic pinned beneath his lapel. He tapped it once. No sound. Twice. Nothing. Across the studio, the big screen behind them flashed with the now familiar message. "Technical difficulties. Please stand by." But the cameras were still rolling. The lights never dimmed. The audience was still seated, watching in silence. The interruption wasn't for them. It was for the viewers at home. Keanu looked toward the production booth. Movement. Shadows of technicians whispering, heads low, fingers flying across keyboards. One producer put on a headset and walked briskly behind the set. On stage, Bill Maher chuckled lightly, filling the silence. "Well, look at that," he said, gesturing toward the banner. "Looks like the universe is trying to tell you something." A few nervous laughs flickered from the audience. Keanu tilted his head slightly, not with amusement, but something closer to understanding. "No," he said softly, his voice clear despite the silence in the official feed. "But mine still works." Bill froze for a half-second, unsure what Keanu meant. Then Keanu reached calmly into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a second mic. Not the studio mic. A personal mic. One that had been transmitting since the moment he stepped onto the stage. Amelia, backstage, tapped her earpiece and checked her tablet. The audio feed from Keanu's private mic was still running, live, being archived and streamed to 3 separate off-site servers in real time. The feed was also mirrored to an encrypted website labeled only with a string of numbers and a single word: contingency. Bill blinked, then smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, you came prepared," he said, adjusting in his chair. Keanu placed the studio mic on the glass table between them with care. "Prepared, yes, but not for a fight, just for a conversation." The crowd was silent, not because they were confused, but because they were starting to see it too. Something wasn't right. The air had changed. The smiles on the crew faded. A sound technician stood completely still, arms at his sides, eyes fixed on the equipment like something had gone wrong that couldn't be fixed fast enough. Bill looked to the side of the stage briefly, then back at Keanu. "Well, we're not here to censor you, Keanu." Keanu didn't answer right away. He leaned forward slightly, hands resting calmly on his knees. "Then why is your show trying so hard not to let people hear me?" Silence again. But this time, it wasn't accidental. It was the beginning of unraveling something much bigger than the room could hold. Bill shifted in his seat again, that signature smirk briefly returning, but now with visible strain beneath it. "You know how live TV is," he said, voice a touch too casual. "These things happen." Keanu didn't respond to the excuse. He simply watched him, eyes steady, not accusing, just present. The kind of presence that made people uncomfortable when they had something to hide. In the audience, the silence had taken on a new texture. It wasn't the silence of confusion or awkwardness anymore. It was the stillness that comes when people realize they're witnessing something they weren't supposed to. Bill tried to move things along. Let's steer back," he said quickly, waving at the crew. "We'll get the mic fixed, folks. Just one of those nights, huh?" No one laughed. Instead, a stage manager appeared at the edge of the curtain and whispered into the headset of a producer. The producer nodded once, then immediately gave a signal toward the sound booth. Something had changed. Again, Bill continued. "Keanu, you've said some powerful things about questioning systems, about truth, about freedom. But isn't there a point where too much doubt becomes destructive?" Keanu raised an eyebrow slightly. "Destructive to whom?" Bill hesitated. "To society. Or to the ones controlling the narrative?" Keanu asked gently. That line sent a ripple through the crowd. A few murmurs. One person near the back clapped once before stopping, not out of rudeness, but because it felt dangerous to break the moment. Bill looked visibly annoyed now. "Come on," he said, almost with a laugh. "You sound like you think there's some coordinated effort to silence you." Keanu didn't move. "I don't need to think it. I just watched it try." Behind them, the large LED screen glitched momentarily. A flicker, a black flash before the technical difficulties banner reappeared. The production booth was scrambling. Amelia watched all of it unfold from backstage. Her tablet lit up with a live confirmation. The studio had initiated a 30-second broadcast delay. That meant viewers at home weren't seeing what was happening in real time anymore. They were seeing what the network allowed them to. And that was the point. Amelia stepped forward slightly, her lips pressed into a line. Keanu glanced once, subtly, in her direction, then back to Bill. "You invited me here to talk," he said, "but the moment the conversation got inconvenient, you muted it." Bill leaned forward now, tone tightening. "This is my show. I ask the questions." Keanu gave a small nod. "I know. That's why I brought my own answers." The audience stirred again. A low thrum of uncertainty filled the room. They weren't watching an interview anymore. They were watching something fall apart. Quietly, efficiently, and without anyone needing to shout. Bill's smile had vanished completely now. He turned toward the side of the stage again, but this time, he didn't see a signal from the booth. He saw two figures begin to step forward. Security. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Keanu noticed. He didn't move, didn't speak, just folded his hands in his lap and sat still. Bill spoke slowly, like trying not to tip something over. "Due to a breach in our broadcast protocol, I'm being told we're going to have to remove our guest." A loud murmur rippled through the audience. The illusion of conversation was gone, and in its place stood something raw, exposed, and ready to collapse. Keanu didn't move right away. He sat in that chair, legs still crossed, hands calmly resting in his lap. The lights burned overhead, the LED screen behind him still flashing with the words "technical difficulties," and yet the cameras continued to roll. Every lens in the studio remained fixed on his face, waiting to see how he'd respond. And for a long beat, he gave them exactly what they didn't expect: silence. Not the silence of surrender or confusion, but of control. A silence that made people lean in, a silence that said, "I'm not rattled, you are." Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Keanu reached into the inside of his blazer. There was no rush, no panic, just precision. He pulled out the lapel mic Amelia had given him earlier. It wasn't connected to the studio's soundboard. It wasn't subject to their controls. This one was his. Encrypted, secure, and recording everything. He pressed 2 fingers against it and tapped once. Immediately, his voice came through the studio's internal speakers. Clear, undistorted, undeniable. "I brought my own," he said calmly. The audience gasped. Some turned to each other. One person near the middle whispered, "Did he just—" He continued speaking. "The truth doesn't rely on your equipment." The studio air shifted. You could feel it. He looked directly at Bill. "It's not afraid of a broken mic. It's only afraid of the moment people stop pretending it doesn't matter." Bill Maher's face tightened. He tried to keep his composure, but his jaw flexed. Behind him, a producer rushed forward, leaned down, and whispered something quickly into his ear. Bill's eyes flicked to the stage manager at the curtain. His fingers curled slightly around the edge of his chair. Then came the next move. 2 men appeared at the side of the stage, dressed in dark suits with earpieces, security. They didn't walk fast, but they walked with purpose. They weren't there for a misunderstanding. They were there to execute a decision. Keanu saw them and gave a small nod, not of submission, of recognition. The audience shifted in their seats. Whispers spread. The mood turned sharply from curiosity to discomfort. Bill leaned forward again, but this time the tone was forced, flat. "Due to violations of federal broadcast standards," he announced, "our guest will be removed from the stage. This decision is not taken lightly." A few gasps echoed. One woman said, "Wait, what?" out loud. Keanu stood up slowly. He adjusted his blazer with both hands. And then he turned, not to Bill, not to the camera, but to the audience. He looked at them, really looked, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "This isn't the end." Then he faced the 2 approaching guards, and without a word he took 1 step toward them. The guards reached Keanu at the edge of the stage. They didn't grab him, they didn't raise their voices. They paused, almost uncertain. Maybe it was the way he stood, calm and unthreatened. Or maybe it was the sudden shift in the room, where the crowd no longer seemed sure who was in the wrong. One of the guards raised a hand halfway. "Sir, we've been instructed—" "I know," Keanu interrupted gently. "I'm not resisting." He extended his wrists forward, a motion that stunned the front row. There was no panic in his body, no tension, just a quiet readiness. The younger guard hesitated, then slowly took out a pair of handcuffs. The sound of metal locking around Keanu's wrists echoed louder than the studio's canned applause ever had. A hush swept over the room. Not shock, not outrage, not yet. Confusion. This wasn't a movie, this wasn't scripted, this was real, and everyone could feel it. Keanu looked toward Amelia. She hadn't moved. She stood just off stage, hands at her sides, face unreadable. From behind the glass of the control booth, producers scrambled. One was barking into a headset, another flipping through a binder of emergency broadcast protocols. A third stood frozen, watching the studio audience with growing unease. They hadn't expected this moment to go so still. One of the camera operators looked at a director for instruction, but the director didn't move. Every instinct told them to cut to commercial, but something else told them not to, because no one knew how this would play on screen, and no one wanted to be the one to own that decision. In the audience, a ripple began. A woman stood, not shouting, just standing. A man in a sweater stood next to her, then another. Then someone in the back row raised a phone, filming silently. No chants, no protests, just presence. Bill cleared his throat and tried to reclaim control. "We invited Mr. Reeves here for a conversation," he said, directing his voice to the camera now. "But we also have rules. We cannot allow anyone, even celebrities, to undermine the structure of the show." He looked at Keanu, who now stood with both guards at either side. Keanu met his gaze and said, "You invited me for truth, but the moment it became inconvenient, you tried to erase it." Bill scoffed. "Come on, no one's erasing anything." Keanu nodded once. "That's why I recorded everything, for the people who will never see the version you planned." The audience murmured again. And suddenly Bill wasn't just facing Keanu. He was facing something much larger. He was facing the beginning of the collapse. As Keanu stood between the guards, hands cuffed calmly in front of him, the studio lights no longer felt warm. They burned, not just for him, but for the people watching, realizing this was no longer a talk show. It was a spectacle that had lost control of its own illusion. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any argument could, and it unnerved everyone who still believed they were holding the strings. Amelia took a single step forward from the side of the curtain. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Stop." The guards looked toward her, uncertain. She held up a hand, then produced a folded piece of paper from the inside of her jacket. She walked toward the nearest one and handed it over. "This is a federally filed injunction," she said, loud enough for the audience to hear. "Under the First Amendment Protection Clause, Section 341C, it blocks any on-air detainment, removal, or suppression of speech without prior court review. It's been time-stamped and registered with the clerk's office as of 6 hours ago." The guard took the paper with careful hands, glancing between Amelia and the producer hovering near the camera rig. Bill Maher laughed awkwardly. "Come on, this is absurd. What even is this?" Amelia didn't answer him. She turned toward the back row of the audience, where a man in a gray suit stood and slowly raised a hand. "I'm the federal legal observer assigned to this segment," he announced. "The document is valid. Enforcement is blocked." A wave of tension spread like an electrical current through the studio. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just stared, because in a matter of minutes, what was framed as an entertainment broadcast had turned into a live legal standoff. Bill sat back in his chair, lips parted, one hand twitching at the edge of the desk. The control room didn't cut the feed. No one moved. No one knew what came next. Keanu lifted his hands slightly, waiting. The younger of the two guards stepped back, unlatched the cuffs, and released his wrists. The sound of the metal opening was soft, but carried through the entire set like a verdict. Keanu rubbed one wrist once, then slowly looked toward the audience. "I came here because I believed in conversation," he said, his voice steady, broadcast now not just through the studio, but directly through his own live feed mic. "I didn't expect to be silenced, but I was ready for it." He turned to face the camera. Not the host, not the crew, the people. Because when power is afraid of truth, it doesn't argue, it suppresses. But truth doesn't vanish just because someone pulled a plug. Amelia stood behind him now, not flanking, just present. Keanu stepped forward once, uncuffed hands open and relaxed. "You can disagree with me," he said. "You can challenge me. But when the system tries to erase a voice rather than engage with it, that's not discussion. That's fear." He paused, and the silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was reverent, the kind that settles not when something ends, but when something real finally begins. And behind the glass of the control room, someone whispered the words that had haunted every producer since the moment he stepped onto that stage. In the way he dressed, he was ready. The cuffs had barely cleared Keanu's wrists when Amelia Hart began walking forward. Not hurried, not hesitant. She moved with the calm of someone who had expected this exact moment and planned for it down to the last second. All eyes shifted from Keanu to her. Even the guards stepped back, their posture unsure now, watching as she approached with a thin, folded sheet of paper held gently between her fingers. She stopped at center stage and turned to the security team. "This," she said, her voice steady and clear, "is a binding federal stay, filed under Protection Clause 31C of the First Amendment. It prohibits any forced removal, detainment, or suppression of speech that has not been reviewed and ruled upon by a court of law." One of the guards hesitated before reaching out to take the paper. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear of her, but of what was unfolding in front of millions of viewers. The other guard looked to Bill Maher for direction. Bill remained seated, blinking rapidly. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk. His smirk, so famous, so practiced, was gone now. In its place, confusion. And something else. Something quieter. He let out a short laugh. It didn't land. "This isn't real," he said, waving a hand toward Amelia. "Come on. She's making this sound like some kind of courtroom." The studio remained frozen. Not a single crew member moved. The control booth went still. From the audience, a chair shifted slightly. A woman cleared her throat, barely audible. Then, from the back row, a man stood up. Older, gray suit, quiet presence. "I can confirm," he said clearly, "that the document is real and valid." He walked forward slowly, pulling credentials from his inner pocket. "I am a court-appointed legal observer for this event, dispatched upon advance request by Mr. Reeves's counsel." Amelia nodded once, without looking at him. The audience let out a ripple of whispers. Phones were being raised now, not for applause or photos, but to record what was no longer a show, but a spectacle of raw legal tension. Bill leaned forward. "You've got to be kidding me." The man looked at him directly. "You invited a guest to speak about truth, then attempted to suppress his voice when it didn't fit your format. That's not entertainment. That's a violation." The silence that followed was louder than anything words could have produced. Amelia turned slightly toward Keanu. He looked at her, then slowly walked back to his chair and sat down. Not as a guest, not as a man who had just been nearly silenced, but as someone who had just reminded an entire room who actually held the mic. Keanu folded his hands in his lap and looked at Bill. "Let's continue the conversation." Bill stared at Keanu like he hadn't heard him right. "Continue?" he said, blinking. "After that little performance?" Keanu didn't raise his voice. "It wasn't a performance, it was protection. You said this was a space for truth. I took you at your word." Amelia remained off to the side now, her presence sharp but still. The guards had stepped fully back, hands clasped in front of them. Neither one had received new orders, and neither seemed eager to act without instruction. The court observer walked over to the edge of the set, stopping just short of the cameras, watching silently. The seal of legitimacy had been stamped on the entire moment. The audience knew it, the crew knew it, even Bill knew it. He sat there, fidgeting with his pen. "We've never had anything like this happen on the show," he muttered. "That's the problem," Keanu replied. "Too many people assume truth will fit into the time slot, but when it doesn't, they cut to commercial." That line landed. A few people in the audience nodded. One person whispered, "Wow," under their breath. Bill tried to rally. "Look, we're not the enemy here. I mean, you're acting like this was a trap, like we were trying to get you to, what, self-destruct on live TV?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Were you?" Bill chuckled dryly, glancing at the crew. No one laughed with him. "I came here in good faith," Keanu said. "And in the first 10 minutes, I watched the audio get cut, the cameras get redirected, and security approach me like I'd broken the law by speaking calmly." He looked directly into Bill's eyes. "If I hadn't come prepared, if I hadn't filed that stay, I'd be gone right now. Quietly escorted off your stage, labeled as non-compliant, while you moved on to the next segment." Bill opened his mouth but had no reply. Malia stepped forward once more. "For the record," she said, addressing the audience as much as the host, "we didn't come here looking for conflict. We came prepared for it. There's a difference." Bill's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to exposure. "You planned for this?" Keanu gave a single small nod. "I didn't know what you'd do. I only knew what I couldn't risk." Bill leaned back. His hand reached for his water glass, but he didn't drink. He just stared at it. The audience remained silent. The tension wasn't theatrical. It was real. A kind of collective awareness was blooming across the room. They weren't watching an argument. They were watching a structure bend under pressure. And the man bending it wasn't raising his voice. He was just refusing to lower his truth. Bill Maher finally looked up from his glass and locked eyes with Keanu. The usual sharpness behind his stare had dulled, not from defeat, but from a dawning realization. This wasn't going the way it was supposed to, not the way the producers mapped it, not the way he rehearsed it in his mind, and most of all, not the way the audience had come to expect from him. Controlled, clipped, clever. He cleared his throat. "All right. Let's talk then." Keanu nodded once. "That's all I came to do." Bill glanced off stage again, where one of the producers gave a tight, unreadable nod. They were still live, still rolling. The delay had been shortened. The viewers at home weren't seeing commercials anymore. They were watching, waiting, and many of them were already recording. Bill leaned forward slightly. "You said something earlier about systems that reward silence, that punish honesty. You think that's where we are right now?" Keanu looked directly into the camera this time. "I think we've crossed into something more dangerous. It's not just that truth gets punished, it's that people start to believe it isn't worth speaking. That silence equals safety, and that comfort is more important than courage." He looked back at Bill. "That's how freedom dies, not with force, with quiet agreement." The audience absorbed every word. There was no cheering, no applause, just silence. And not the kind that begged for someone to break it. It was the kind that hung in the air, dense and undeniable. Bill sat back in his chair. "So, you came here to be silenced?" "No," Keanu said. "I came here to find out if the invitation was sincere. And now, I think you hoped it would look sincere, until it wasn't." Bill exhaled slowly, tapping the side of his pen against his thigh. "Look, we push people on this show. We challenge them. It's part of the format. Challenge is healthy," Keanu agreed. "So is disagreement. But this wasn't that. This was a stage built to collapse beneath me. And when it didn't, when I didn't, you tried to end the segment instead of continuing the conversation. The truth landed again. Firm, clean. Amelia didn't speak. She didn't need to. The document she delivered was still in the guard's hand. The observer was still watching, and the entire country was still tuned in. From the second row, a voice called out, not loud but clear, "We want to hear him." Bill flinched slightly, then looked out over the audience. A second voice followed, "Let him speak." Then a third, "You brought him here, let him finish." It wasn't a chant, it wasn't a protest. It was a reckoning. Keanu sat there, still cuff-free, still unshaken, and Bill, for the first time in the entire broadcast, didn't know what to say. Because the audience hadn't turned on Keanu, they had turned on the idea that the conversation had ever been real. And in that shift, The power didn't just change hands. It revealed who'd been holding it all along. And it wasn't the man behind a desk. Bill Maher tried to smile again, but it no longer felt like a smile. It felt like someone reaching for a lever that no longer worked. He straightened his jacket and leaned forward. "Keanu, with all due respect, you're making this political." The line was familiar. A classic pivot. Reframe the tension, turn it into ideology, reduce it into talking points. But Keanu didn't even blink. "No," he said. "I'm making it personal, because it is." He let the words settle before continuing. "It's personal when a 17-year-old student in Ohio gets suspended for writing an essay about censorship in a public school. Not because he said anything dangerous, but because he asked why he couldn't." The audience stayed silent. Keanu kept going. "It's personal when a nurse in Seattle gets fired after reporting that her hospital was reusing gloves between patients. She wasn't making it up, she was protecting people, but her honesty didn't fit the image the administrators wanted, so they erased her." Bill tried to interject, but Keanu didn't raise his voice. He just continued speaking with the kind of calm that made interruptions feel foolish. "It's personal, Bill, for every person who's ever been told to lower their voice so someone more comfortable can feel powerful." The audience began to shift again. This wasn't a media moment anymore, it was a real one. "I didn't come here for drama," Keanu said. "I came because someone has to be willing to sit in this chair and not flinch when the lights get hot." Bill scoffed softly. "That's a nice monologue, but we're still a TV show, and this feels like theater." At that, Amelia moved. She stepped out from the side of the curtain, lifting a small device in her hand. She gave a single nod to someone behind the camera crew. A producer hesitated, then tapped a button on the console, and the screen behind the stage came to life. At first, it was just static. Then it locked into a frame. Footage. The audience leaned forward as the screen flickered again. Then it played. The screen stabilized. The timestamp in the corner read 3:42 p.m., just 3 hours before the broadcast. The setting was familiar to anyone who had worked in television, a studio green room. Not the one Keanu sat in. This one was occupied by Bill Maher and 2 senior producers. The audio was crystal clear. Bill was sitting with his feet up on a coffee table, sipping from a paper cup. One of the producers leaned in. "He's already here, sitting quietly, like he's meditating or something." Bill smirked. "Good. Let him think it's going to be all zen and philosophical." The second producer looked down at her tablet. "So we're going with the ice bath angle?" Bill nodded. "Yeah, let him ramble about the soul and freedom. Then we hit him with the policy stuff. Make it look like he's flirting with dangerous ideas." "What if he pushes back?" the first producer asked. "Then we pivot, call it misinformation. Pull his mic if we have to. This crowd won't care. They came here for a spectacle." The screen paused. The audience in the studio sat frozen. No one moved. No one blinked. Even the stage lights seemed to dim slightly under the weight of what they had just seen. Bill's face went slack. Not embarrassed, not angry. Exposed. Keanu stayed seated. He didn't look at Bill. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the audience. And still he didn't say a word. Because he didn't need to. Amelia took a step closer to the edge of the frame. "That footage is pulled from a secure recording archived at the time of capture. It has already been submitted for independent verification. It's authentic." Bill turned toward her. "This isn't fair. You don't know the context." Amelia's expression didn't change. "We don't need context when the goal was clear. This wasn't a conversation, it was a setup." A low sound rose from the crowd. Not boos, not gasps. Disgust. One voice whispered from the second row, just loud enough to carry. "They really tried to humiliate him." Bill stood up halfway, then sat back down like he couldn't decide which position gave him more control. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. Keanu finally spoke again. It was out of hand. Would have been letting you win. He looked back toward the camera. You tried to make me small. Not by argument, but by ambush. That's not how real conversations happen. That's how power keeps people afraid to speak. The screen behind him dimmed to black. But the truth, once revealed, couldn't be turned off. The black screen behind them faded into darkness, but the silence it left behind was louder than anything that had been said. It wasn't dramatic silence. It was clarity. A kind of stillness that made everyone in the room feel like they were standing at the edge of something deeper than just a failed segment. Bill leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hands clasped tightly. Look, I've been doing this a long time, Keanu. We push people, we ask hard questions. That's the point. People come on here to be challenged. Keanu responded without pause. Challenging people isn't the problem. Challenging someone with a preloaded trap and calling it journalism, that's the problem. A few audience members nodded visibly now, some leaning forward in their seats. Phones were still out, but now they weren't just recording, they were live streaming. Clips of the earlier footage were already hitting the internet. Bill gestured toward the cameras with a shrug. People love outrage, Keanu. If you hadn't shown up with all this, no one would be talking about this episode tomorrow. Keanu didn't smile. That's exactly the issue. We've confused attention with value, outrage with truth. But there are people out there who are watching this right now, not for the drama, but because they've been in this position, silenced, mocked, stripped of credibility just for asking the wrong question. Bill shifted again, this time visibly uncomfortable. You think I'm the villain here? I think you stopped listening to your own voice a long time ago, Keanu said gently. And now you fill that silence with noise. That landed like a stone. For a long moment, Bill didn't say anything. His mouth opened, but no words came. He glanced to the side of the set, maybe looking for a cue, maybe for a way out. But there wasn't one. The audience wasn't looking to be entertained anymore. They were watching a reckoning. Amelia stepped forward again, her voice calm but firm. For transparency, I should inform the network that full transcripts of tonight's recording have already been submitted to our legal archive, including your production notes and all internal communications related to the segment's design. Bill blinked. You archived our planning files? Ellie were included in our pre-show subpoena notice, Amelia said, sent this morning. Bill turned toward the production booth, where one of the assistant producers gave a small nod, confirmation that it was true. Keanu stood slowly, not abruptly, not defiantly, just calmly. I didn't come here to humiliate you, he said, but I also didn't come here to be managed like a character in a skit. He looked around the studio, the lights, the audience, the silence. I came here because I believe people are tired of being manipulated, tired of being told what's acceptable to say and what's acceptable to feel. Then he turned toward the camera one last time. And if we keep pretending these kinds of performances or conversations, we're going to lose something we won't know how to rebuild. He sat back down again, not because he needed to, but because the seat now belonged to him. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. They were listening. For the first time all night, they truly were. The screen behind the set blinked back to life. It began as a wide-angle shot of the same green room seen earlier, only this time from a slightly different perspective. The camera was mounted high, tucked near a ventilation duct. The footage was dated and time-stamped. The voices were clear. Bill Maher was standing near the snack counter, tossing grapes into a paper cup. Two senior producers stood beside him, one holding a clipboard, the other checking her phone. Okay, Bill said, casually tossing a grape in the air and catching it with his mouth. So, we're agreed then? We'll let him do his calm monk philosopher routine for the first 10 minutes. The woman with the clipboard nodded, then cut the mic. Exactly, Bill said, his tone light but pointed. Make it look like a technical issue. When he starts getting into that human soul and personal truth stuff. Bam, audio drops. The male producer added, "And if he reacts, it makes him look paranoid. If he doesn't, we steer the narrative. Either way, we control the visual." Bill grinned. "We let him talk just enough to hang himself. Then we step in, looking like the adults in the room." He dropped the rest of the grapes into a trash can and brushed his hands. "Oh," he added with a chuckle, "make sure we've got the off-air response covered too. If he storms out, we've got the emotional overreaction narrative. If he stays and pushes back, we spin it as confrontational. Either way, we're clean." The screen paused on Bill's face, mid-laugh. The studio audience was dead silent, then a gasp, then murmurs. One person stood, another followed, then a sharp, unexpected boo. Bill Maher, seated at his desk, turned pale. Not red, not flustered, pale, like the color had drained out of him and left nothing behind but the realization that this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was exposure. "That's edited," he said, his voice cracking. "That's been cut together." He looked toward the booth. "Tell me that's not the version we loaded." That's not what we said." Amelia stepped forward. Her tone never rose, her pace never quickened. "We have the full raw cut archived in 3 independent locations," she said. "It has been digitally verified and logged by 2 forensic audio analysts. If you'd like us to play the remaining footage, we can continue from the moment you said, and I quote, 'If we can't catch him slipping, we'll make it look like he already did.'" Bill's jaw opened slyly. He didn't speak, because there was nothing left to say. The murmurs in the crowd were no longer whispers. They were small eruptions, shocked exclamations, indignant gasps, audible shifts of weight in chairs as people physically leaned away from the host. The tone in the room had turned, and everyone felt it. This wasn't just an awkward moment anymore. It was betrayal, and it had been caught on tape. Bill sat frozen, blinking rapidly, his body slightly turned toward the booth as if looking for an invisible off switch. His voice, when it came, was thin. "You're blowing this out of proportion." No one responded, so he pushed harder. "Every show has planning. That's how this works. It's not malicious. It's logistics, framing, pacing. I mean, we do this with everyone." Keanu finally moved, but just slightly. He uncrossed his legs and sat up straighter in his chair. The movement was so subtle it wouldn't have meant anything in another context, but here it felt like a declaration. "If that's your definition of normal," he said, "then the problem isn't me." Bill turned toward him. "We were going to ask real questions." "No," Keanu said quietly. "You were going to dress me up as a caricature of dissent and hope I'd either crumble or lash out. Either way, you win the edit. That's not a question. That's a character assassination in slow motion." Someone in the third row stood up. "This is wrong," she said aloud, voice shaking. "This whole thing. I brought my daughter here because she loves you, Bill. But this is ugly." Bill looked at her, stunned. Another voice joined in. "You let him walk into a trap." Keanu didn't look at the people speaking. He stayed focused on Bill. "There's a reason I came prepared," he continued, "because I've seen too many people walk into rooms like this, thinking they were invited to speak, only to find out they were being set up to be shamed." Amelia raised her tablet and tapped the side once. The large screen behind them lit up again, this time showing a legal certification stamp across the top of the video. Underneath it were 3 bold lines. "Unedited raw footage, authenticated, admissible." Amelia didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The screen said enough. Bill stood up now, or tried to. He rose a few inches before sitting back down as though the motion betrayed him, exposed him even more. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly rattled. "Okay," he said, chuckling softly. "So we got a little aggressive. Big deal." No one laughed. "No," Keanu said. "This wasn't aggression. It was orchestration, and the worst part is, you didn't do it to protect anyone, You did it for ratings, for a viral moment." His voice softened, but it somehow hit harder. "You didn't come here to challenge truth. You came here to choreograph its failure." The weight of those words crushed the last defense in Bill's expression. His shoulders dropped, his hands fidgeted with the edge of his desk, and the audience? They didn't boo again. They didn't need to. They had already chosen who they were listening to. And it wasn't the man behind the desk anymore. The silence that followed was no longer tentative. It was decisive. Final. It was the kind of silence that closes a chapter before anyone has the nerve to admit it's over. And in that silence, Bill Maher looked small. Not physically, but in presence, in command. He no longer owned the room. The moment didn't belong to him. He turned once more toward the booth. "Can someone cut the feed, please?" The voice that responded didn't come from a crew member. It came from the back of the audience. "Let it roll." Heads turned. The voice belonged to a man standing near the exit, a producer, one of Bill's own team. His badge hung clearly from his lanyard. He wasn't shouting, he was simply stating it. "Legal's watching now." Bill's mouth opened slightly. That sentence landed like a hammer behind his ribs. His eyes darted back toward Amelia, who remained still, her hands folded, tablet cradled loosely in her arms. Keanu spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You didn't just try to silence me. You tried to script me." He stood once more, not for show, but with a kind of weary calm that came from being right and knowing it wouldn't feel like a victory. "I sat through your monologue, your applause lines, your traps. I knew what was coming. And I came anyway, because I'm not here to perform. I'm here because there's someone out there watching this who has been made to feel small for speaking up. I came for them." From the back of the studio, a voice cracked with emotion. "I was fired last month," it said, "for telling the truth." Heads turned again. A woman stood slowly, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "My boss told me to change safety data. I wouldn't. So they let me go." Keanu looked at her. Not as a savior, not as a celebrity, just as someone who understood. "You're the reason I'm here," he said gently. Bill remained seated. He didn't interrupt. For the first time in his career, he didn't know how to. And then, from the second row, a young man stood up. "I used to watch this show to hear ideas debated," he said. "But this isn't a debate. It's a trap disguised as a spotlight." Bill opened his mouth to push back, but the words died before reaching air. Keanu glanced toward Amelia, who nodded once. "We're done here," she said, voice steady. Keanu turned toward the audience, toward the room that had witnessed a mask fall off in real time. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about how quickly people get used to seeing dissent punished as disruption. That's how freedom erodes. Quietly, comfortably, with laughter tracks." He paused, then added softly, "And all it takes to break that cycle is one person willing to sit still. When the ground starts shaking." He stepped back. The cameras kept rolling, and the silence he left behind didn't fade. It settled into every seat in the room. The studio was still recovering from the fallout when a soft voice broke through the silence. It didn't come from the stage or the control booth or the audience's front row. It came from near the back. "I'm sorry." Heads turned. A young woman had risen from her seat along the far aisle. She wore a headset slung awkwardly around her shoulders, a production assistant badge clipped to her blouse. She looked no older than 24. Her voice was shaking. "I wasn't supposed to speak," she said, "but I can't stay quiet anymore." Bill Maher leaned forward, his face tight. "What is this?" The young woman stepped out from her row, her hands trembling as she held up a slim tablet. On the screen was a collection of graphic overlays, lower thirds, camera transitions, pre-written captions. "I'm part of the pre-show graphics team," she said, almost apologizing as she spoke. "We were instructed to build 2 versions of tonight's ending, one if Mr. Reeves walked off, one if he stayed and lost his temper." Gasps rippled through the audience. Someone near the front row muttered, "They had backups for that?" The young woman's face flushed with anxiety, but she stood her ground. He told us to prepare taglines like, "Guest storms off set," or "Hollywood star meltdown caught on camera." The files were time-coded, pre-built. Bill turned pale again. "You're misunderstanding the directive," he said, his voice tight. "That's not proof of anything. That's standard production preparedness." The woman's hands gripped the tablet tighter. "No, it wasn't. They never do that for normal segments. We were given those orders before the show even started." The system had the graphics pre-loaded, ready to go. They even color-coded which one to trigger based on how the live segment unfolded. Keanu turned and made eye contact with her. His expression didn't shift, but there was something in his gaze, steady, quiet recognition, that let her know she wasn't alone. She looked at him for only a second longer, then dropped her gaze and sat down, clearly rattled. But the damage was already done. The audience erupted into whispers. Some looked horrified, others just stunned. A woman with her arms crossed stood up and said, "So it really was scripted. They came in ready to humiliate him." Amelia stepped forward again, calm as ever, and placed a small folder on Bill's desk. "There's more," she said. Bill stared at it like it might explode. "What now?" he asked bitterly. "Another video? Another dramatic reveal?" "No," Amelia replied. "Documentation. Internal scheduling emails. Time-stamped directives from your own staff. It proves the graphics were planned alongside rehearsal cues. There was never any intent for real dialogue." The room fell quiet again. This time, no one came to Bill's defense. He reached forward slowly and opened the folder. Inside were printed email threads. One caught his eye. It read, "Keanu won't expect it. He's too polite. If we keep it sharp and tight, he'll either retreat or react. Either way, we win." The sender was one of his producers. The CC line included 3 more. Bill stared at the printed email for several seconds, his hand resting flat on the page like he could silence it by touch alone. But the words wouldn't disappear. Neither would the CC line. Names he knew well, faces he passed every day in the halls, people he trusted to maintain control of the narrative. Across the studio, more audience members were standing now, not out of protest, but awakening. A man near the aisle whispered, "This was never a show, it was a setup." Another shook her head in disbelief. How many times have they done this and gotten away with it? Keanu remained seated, arms resting on his knees. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply watched. The whole room was no longer spinning around the host. It was rotating slowly around the truth, and the gravity had shifted entirely. Amelia stepped away from the desk and turned toward the audience, lifting her voice just slightly so every row could hear. This young woman who spoke out. Her name is Leia. She's a production assistant, and her courage just exposed something no document ever could. Leia looked up from her seat, visibly startled to hear her name spoken aloud. "You didn't sign up to be in the middle of this," Amelia said, meeting her gaze. "But you spoke anyway. That's what accountability looks like." Bill finally stood, but it wasn't defiant. It wasn't the rise of someone regaining control. It was slow, cautious, almost like standing up in church after hearing a confession you didn't know how to live with. He faced the audience, palms open. "I didn't know they'd take it that far," he said. "Yes, we plan segments. Yes, we prep reactions. But I didn't approve this." No one applauded. No one responded. Because what followed that kind of admission wasn't recovery. It was reflection. Keanu spoke again, gently. "This isn't about whether you approved every line. It's about what happens when we let systems run without conscience. When people in power stop asking why something is being done and only care how it plays on air." He stood slowly, and the audience, already silent, seemed to grow even more still. "Tonight was never about me," he said. "It was about every person who's been framed to fail because someone behind a desk thought, The fallout would make good television. His voice didn't rise, but it carried. Every word settled into the room like dust after a collapse. Leah wiped her eyes. Bill sat down again, this time without prompting. His hands were folded, his eyes unfocused. Amelia returned to the edge of the stage, her voice clear. "We'll be submitting a formal inquiry into the network's practices. What happened here is not just unethical, it may be unlawful." And then she looked directly at the camera. "To anyone watching who's been told to stay quiet for the sake of optics, this moment is for you." Keanu glanced at her, then at the studio audience, many now standing, some holding their phones over their hearts like shields. Then he nodded once to Leah. It was small, but it was enough. And somehow, in a room once built for a takedown, something else had been constructed instead. A reckoning. And the beginning of something honest. Amelia stood center stage now. In her hand was a single sheet of paper. The audience had already seen enough to understand what it meant the moment she unfolded it. Her voice, though still calm, carried a new tone. Measured outrage, layered beneath control. "This is a transcript," she began, "from a recorded production planning call that took place 48 hours before tonight's show. It includes 3 producers, 1 senior editor, and the show's PR strategist." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before reading. The segment was given an internal code name, Operation Ice Bath. Gasps echoed across the audience. Amelia continued, reading clearly and without embellishment. Quote, "Operation Ice Bath is simple. We hit him hard early, make him stumble in front of the crowd. The audience will freeze. If he stutters, we keep pressure. If he's too composed, we trigger the mic cut. If he fights back, we spin it as paranoia. If he stays calm, we label him cold. Either way, we walk away looking like the reasonable ones." A stunned silence overtook the room. Another line followed. "His reputation's too clean. This'll make him bleed just enough to remind people he's still human. They'll stop seeing him as above the noise." People in the audience were no longer seated. Many stood now, some recording, others just standing still in disbelief. Amelia folded the document carefully and looked out over the rows of people watching. This was never about having a conversation. It was a strategy session, a campaign. And tonight was the execution. A young man from the audience shouted, "That's not journalism!" Someone else near the front muttered, "It's character assassination." Bill Maher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles pale. He looked toward the screen, then toward Amelia, and finally toward the audience. "It's showbiz," he blurted. His voice rang out louder than expected, a forced laugh cracking behind the words. "You think this is some grand conspiracy? It's a talk show. We plan segments, we create moments. That's how this works." No one laughed. A few shook their heads, others just stared at him, unmoved. Bill tried again. "You don't understand the pressure, the ratings, the expectations. We're not saints, we're entertainers." Keanu stood. Slowly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He just let the moment breathe before speaking. "Then why are you afraid of the real show?" The room froze. Keanu turned toward Bill. "If this is entertainment, then why were you scared of me sitting in a chair and speaking plainly? Why did you need a plan to make me unravel? If I'm so harmless, why build an operation just to make me flinch?" He stepped closer, not as a threat, but as a man dismantling the illusion piece by piece. "If you're the honest one, why the code names? Why the contingency graphics? Why the secret edits, the legal skirting, the hidden rehearsals?" He stopped, looking around the studio. "Maybe it's not that I'm too calm. Maybe it's that your show has forgotten what calm looks like." Bill opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For a long second, the only sound in the studio was the faint humming of the overhead lights. Keanu stepped back slightly, still calm, still grounded. "You said it's showbiz," he repeated softly. "But showbiz doesn't require betrayal. It doesn't demand manipulation. And it doesn't need to trap people to keep the lights on." From the third row, someone whispered, "This isn't entertainment anymore." Amelia turned to face the audience again. She raised her tablet and tapped the screen. Behind them, the screen lit up once more. This time, with real-time social media reactions flooding in like a digital storm. The first trending hashtag was already on the board. It was Operation Ice Bath, followed by Let Keanu Speak. Broadcast, Bill Exposed. Posts scrolled live, captured and shared by millions now watching the stream online. Influencers, journalists, even rival hosts were weighing in. One post read, "This is a takedown attempt caught mid-flight, and the pilot just lost control." Another, "Keanu didn't break the system, he just stood still long enough for it to collapse on itself." The impact was no longer theoretical, it was viral. Bill looked up at the screen, his face stricken. His smirk was gone. His voice, when it finally returned, was faint. "You don't understand," he muttered. "This show, it's built on tension. It's built on drama." Keanu turned back toward him. "So you create it where it doesn't exist? Manufacture it with trap doors and mic cuts?" He walked forward slowly, one step at a time, never raising his voice. "Do you know what people are desperate for right now? Not more tension, not more theatrics, just something real. A voice that doesn't come with a script attached." He gestured lightly toward the screen, still pulsing with live reactions. "They're not cheering because I shouted louder. They're listening because I..." Amelia closed the screen, leaving the studio in raw stillness once again. Keanu stepped back toward his chair, but didn't sit this time. He remained standing, firm, patient. "The world's not asking for perfect people," he said. "It's asking for honest ones." And tonight, the honesty didn't come from the host. It came from a production assistant who couldn't keep quiet while the machine rolled on. Leia, still seated in the crowd, visibly swallowed. The people around her turned with gratitude in their eyes. Bill collapsed into his chair, shoulders hunched. His hand went to his mouth, not to speak, but to hold back whatever truth he wasn't ready to face. Keanu turned toward the camera, knowing millions were still watching. This is what happens when you try to freeze someone with a mic cut and a camera angle. Sometimes the silence you try to create just ends up making their voice louder. He paused. And sometimes that silence echoes farther than you ever meant it to. A new silence followed. Not of control, not of shame, but of realization. Silence that comes right after the curtain falls. Only this time, no one was clapping. They were thinking. And that was more powerful than applause. Keanu remained standing at the center of the stage, unmoved. His posture calm. No theatrics. No triumph, just presence. A moment ago, his words had brought the room to a pause. But what happened next would shatter any lingering doubts that this evening had ever been about a fair exchange of ideas. Amelia stepped toward the control booth and gave a small, deliberate nod. The screen behind the set flickered again. A soft hum filled the studio as the next video loaded. This time, there was no timestamp in the corner. Just a rehearsal room. A wide, open set with chairs, lights, and a long desk in the center. Several people milled about. Producers, camera crew, a director pacing with a clipboard in hand. Then, a man entered the frame. He wasn't Keanu, but he was wearing similar clothes. Dark blazer, dark jeans, plain black boots. A stand-in. Another voice echoed off camera. "All right, let's do a test run of the takedown moment. Audio drops in 30 seconds. We'll practice both reactions, panic and cold silence." The stand-in took his seat across from another man pretending to be Bill. He raised a hand, mimicking a gesture Keanu had made on a previous appearance. The fake Bill leaned in. "So, you're saying people should just say whatever they want?" The stand-in responded with an exaggerated version of Keanu's signature calm. "I'm saying we have the right to think for ourselves." One of the producers off camera laughed. "Wow, he's nailing the monk vibe." Hit the interference cue. A sound engineer called out, "Glitching now." The audio feed filled with artificial static. In the footage, the stand-in tapped his mic. "No sound. What a shame," said the fake Bill, smirking. Another person chimed in, mimicking concern. "Someone check his mic. Don't let it look too intentional." The producer, pacing the floor, laughed. "Perfect. We'll edit it like he's confused. We'll use a wide shot. That way it won't feel like an attack. Just a production hiccup." In the background, someone else called out, "Got backup clips of him sitting still? If we need to dub in commentary later, we can insert the reaction shot." The rehearsal footage continued for another 30 seconds, rotating between false concern and strategic cruelty. Then came the line that silenced even the control room, watching the playback live. One of the producers said, "If we do it right, he won't even know it's scripted." The screen froze. The studio audience sat frozen with it. This wasn't opinion. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't spin. It was evidence, pure and ugly. The truth wasn't just that someone had tried to silence Keanu. It was that they'd rehearsed it, rehearsed how to humiliate him, discredit him, and disguise it all as television. Keanu didn't speak. Not yet. He just let the moment sit there, suspended in the air like a weight that couldn't be ignored. The audience didn't gasp this time. They didn't boo. They didn't even whisper. Because this time they understood. It hadn't been a glitch. It had been a decision. And silence was no longer uncertainty. It was understanding. The frozen frame on the screen seemed to pulse in the studio's quiet air. The image of the rehearsal, actors impersonating sincerity, producers mocking vulnerability, hung there like an open wound. No one moved. Not the crew, not the guards, not the audience. Keanu stood still, his face composed but unreadable. He could have said something, he could have condemned them, but he didn't. He let the footage speak. Amelia finally stepped forward, her voice the only sound in the room. "This recording was submitted through an anonymous internal source," she said. "We've verified its origin. Time-stamped rehearsals, communications backed up. These weren't improvisations. They were blueprints." Bill slumped slightly in his chair, hand over his mouth, his eyes cast downward. The man who once commanded the center of the room now looked as if he wished he could disappear into it. Someone in the third row whispered, "They practiced humiliating him." Another voice followed. "They laughed while doing it." Third voice, "How many others have they done this to?" Keanu slowly walked toward the desk. He didn't confront Bill. He didn't raise his tone. He simply looked at the screen one more time, then turned back to the audience. This is what happens when the show becomes more important than the truth. His words were slow, intentional. When real people becomes product, when real people become props. He paused. And when silence is rehearsed, before it's even earned. Leia stood up again, her voice still trembling but firmer now. "They told us to stay quiet, that this was just how the business works." Keanu looked at her and nodded once. "It's only how the business works until someone decides it won't anymore." Another crew member in the back of the room removed his headset, quietly, deliberately. He set it on the control panel and stepped away from the equipment. "I'm done," he said simply. Then a second, and a third. Bill finally spoke again, barely above a whisper. "This wasn't supposed to go this way." Keanu's eyes met his. "It went exactly the way it was supposed to. You just thought the silence would hold." A ripple moved through the audience. Not a shout, not applause, but something deeper. A collective understanding that what they had witnessed wasn't just media manipulation. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, and the realization that the curtain wasn't broken. It had been drawn, intentionally, to hide the design. Amelia closed her tablet and stepped away from the desk. "The footage has been mirrored to multiple databases," she said. "It will remain public." Keanu turned toward the camera one last time. "To everyone watching, this isn't about revenge. This is about responsibility. If you've ever been told to stay quiet, to edit yourself so others can stay comfortable, You already know what this was. He didn't ask them to speak. He didn't demand anything. He simply walked back to center stage and stood in the silence he had earned, not by yelling, but by refusing to move when they expected him to fall. Amelia walked with quiet purpose across the stage. Her heels didn't click, her pace didn't waver. She carried no rage, no drama, just a document, neatly folded, sealed with a red tab. She stopped at the edge of the seating area where the legal observer from earlier still sat, stoic and watchful. Without ceremony, she handed him the document. He accepted it with a quiet nod. "For the record," Amelia said clearly, addressing not only the observer but the entire studio, "this is a formal notice of defamation liability. Transcripts from this evening's exchange have already been archived. Independent observers were present from the moment Mr. Reeves arrived on the lot." She stepped back, but her voice remained steady and audible. "This moment is now on legal record." A fresh wave of tension swept through the room, the kind that came not from a threat, but from inevitability. Bill finally spoke again, his voice weak but urgent. "You can't be serious. You're turning a misunderstanding into a lawsuit?" Amelia looked at him, expression blank. "No. The lawsuit began the moment you weaponized your stage to harm another person's reputation under the guise of dialogue." The legal observer nodded once, removing a pen from his inner pocket and signing his name on the acknowledgement line. He folded the paper, tucked it into his briefcase, and said nothing more. The control room behind the glass pulsed with activity. Red lights blinking, producers shouting over each other through headsets, techs scrambling between consoles. One of the assistant directors leaned too close to an open mic, forgetting it was still live. The words came through the studio's speakers, unfiltered. "We've lost 3 sponsors already. Another just pulled out mid-show." The gasp that followed was not theatrical. It was stunned, authentic. Because now the cost wasn't abstract, it was measurable, real, and irreversible. Bill looked toward the booth, face pale, sweat visible now at his temple. He stammered, "That's just panic. People always overreact in the moment." Keanu stepped forward, not with anger, not with triumph, just quiet truth. "You didn't just lose sponsors," he said. "You lost something much harder to get back." Bill blinked at him. "What?" "Trust." The words settled like ash over the entire room. Keanu continued, "You built a platform pretending to hold space for ideas, but when someone brought an idea you couldn't control, you didn't challenge it. You tried to bury it." He looked around at the cameras, the crew, the audience, then back at Bill. "And in doing so, you proved why the truth still matters?" Behind the glass, the control room no longer resembled a show in progress. It looked like a broadcast going down, live. Producers holding phones to their ears, assistants crying quietly in corners, techs waiting for directives no one was willing to give. And outside the studio, phones across the country buzzed with live updates. Screenshots, video clips, headlines forming in real time. Bill Maher confronted live. Rehearsed, takedown exposed. The collapse of a media machine. And in the center of it all stood a man who had said little, yet shifted everything. The headlines weren't just on screens now. They were whispered in the room itself. People in the audience were refreshing their phones, reading updates out loud in stunned voices. The world outside had already seized the story, and the studio walls couldn't keep it in. Bill stood again, his hands open, voice shaking. "This has gone too far. It's a misunderstanding that's spiraled into public spectacle." Keanu didn't move. He stood center stage, unbothered by the storm. "No, this isn't a spiral. This is a mirror. You just don't like what it's showing." Bill looked toward the legal observer, as if hoping for rescue, but the man only watched, expression unreadable. He wasn't there to protect feelings. He was there to witness facts. Amelia stepped forward once more. "You told the world tonight was about ideas," she said. "But every layer we've peeled back, every clip, document, and testimony has shown the same thing. You didn't build a conversation. You built a trap. Bill's jaw clenched. You think I planned all this personally? No, Keanu said, calmly. We think you allowed it. And that's worse. In the booth, another voice buzzed through the system. We've been flagged by 2 compliance boards. This may not air again. Legal wants everyone off the set. The words came out clearly over the house speakers. Another mistake. Another cut in the illusion. The audience shifted again. This time more people stood. They weren't chanting. They weren't screaming. They were watching. Bearing witness. Fully awake. Bill finally dropped into his chair, like something in his legs had given up. I don't know what else to say, he whispered. You don't have to, Keanu replied. The show already did. Another alert flashed on Amelia's tablet. She glanced down, then back up at Keanu. It's begun trending globally, she said. Every continent, every language. He's turned slightly, looking at the audience now. They'll say I hijacked the show. They'll say this was a stunt, that I came for drama, but I didn't. He took a breath. His tone never rose, but it deepened. I came for truth, I stayed for accountability. Someone near the back of the audience called out, Thank you. Another echoed, We needed this. A third, It's about time someone stood up. Keanu didn't smile. He just nodded, once, acknowledging the voices, then looked to Amelia. She addressed the room. The video files, legal filings, and internal memos will be released in full, every second, every document. Nothing will be hidden. Let the people decide what this moment really was. Bill remained silent now, head in his hands. His show, the one he'd built on timing, tension, and control, was still rolling, but he wasn't driving it anymore. Keanu looked toward the cameras, now streaming to millions. This isn't the fall of one man, he said. It's the unveiling of a pattern, a reminder that when truth is suppressed, it doesn't vanish. It waits, and when it returns, it brings everything with it. The lights hadn't dimmed. The cameras hadn't come, but everyone knew it. The collapse had already begun, and nothing, not edits, sponsors, or spin, could stop it now. The moment had spread far beyond the studio, across the city, across the country, across borders, and now it was right outside the doors. On the screens inside the studio, a new live feed replaced the hashtags and replayed footage. This one came from a news helicopter hovering above the broadcast building. It showed a crowd. Hundreds of people had gathered in the street, shoulder to shoulder, some wrapped in jackets, others still in work uniforms. The glow of candlelight shimmered across the sidewalk like quiet fire. Some held handmade signs. Most didn't shout. They didn't need to. One sign read, "Let him speak." Another, "Silence isn't neutral." Another, "Truth doesn't need editing." The camera panned slowly, capturing it all. A mother held her child, who was holding a tablet showing Keanu's face, frozen in mid-sentence. A retired schoolteacher spoke softly to a young man with a press badge. A line of students from a local college stood shoulder to shoulder, phones in the air, not to record, but to live stream, for those who couldn't be there. The movement hadn't been organized. No one called for it. It simply happened. One person stood up, then another, and now the world was outside the very room that tried to contain the truth. Inside, the studio lights still burned, but the heat was gone, replaced by something deeper. Reverence. Reckoning. Keanu didn't turn toward the feed. He didn't need to. The glow from the screen behind him painted his silhouette across the stage. He stood in silence, not as a symbol, not as a hero, as a man who had refused to run when they tried to make him disappear. Amelia glanced at the live shot, then looked at him. The world is watching. Keanu gave the smallest nod, not one of pride, but acknowledgement. Not everyone wanted to know, but enough people were ready to. At the desk, Bill Maher stared at the screen like it was the first time he'd seen the outside world in years. The signs, the candles, the stillness, all of it cut deeper than any commentary. He swallowed, blinked, then looked at Keanu. "Maybe," he said slowly, "maybe I crossed the line." It wasn't loud, it wasn't performative, but it wasn't an apology either. The words hung in the air, awkward and uncertain. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't nod. He didn't offer a lifeline. Because the line had already been crossed, not in words, but in intent. And the difference between regret and survival wasn't subtle. It was everything. Bill looked at him again, hoping for something. Redemption, forgiveness, even just a softening in Keanu's posture. But it never came. The audience saw it clearly. This wasn't about who won. It wasn't about television or ratings or even exposure. It was about the cost of betrayal. Quiet, careful, calculated betrayal. And now, it was playing out in real time. With candles, with silence, with the eyes of a watching world. The live footage outside continued streaming silently behind them. No narration, no commentary, just raw video of a growing crowd, unified not by anger, but clarity. From the studio, it was impossible not to feel it. The protest wasn't loud, it wasn't hostile, it didn't try to storm the doors or shout anyone down. It was calm, still, the kind of silence that demanded more attention than noise ever could. Bill Maher sat hunched forward at the desk, his hands clasped. He stared at the screen, lips parted but unable to speak. His voice, once a weapon, had failed him. He looked smaller now, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been seen. The audience in the studio hadn't moved. They didn't need to. Their silence mirrored the crowd outside. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. This wasn't a climax. It was a revelation. Keanu slowly looked toward the screen behind him. His eyes scanned the peaceful line of people, some holding signs, others holding one another. He saw no outrage. He saw resolve. He didn't look proud or vindicated. He looked like someone who wished this hadn't been necessary, but knew it always was. Amelia stepped closer, tablet in hand. She read softly, without raising her voice. Major outlets are now running the footage live. International networks have picked it up. The story has crossed into 5 languages. A televised takedown that failed. That's the headline. Bill let out a dry breath. That's what I'll be remembered for. Keanu glanced at him, his expression unreadable. That's up to you, he said. Not because of tonight, but because of what you do tomorrow. Bill didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because he wasn't sure what tomorrow looked like anymore. From the back of the studio, someone began clapping. Just once. Then again. It wasn't for applause. It wasn't to celebrate. It was acknowledgement. Then someone else joined. A slow, quiet rhythm. 2 or 3 beats at a time. Not demanding, not loud. Just steady. Keanu didn't raise a hand. Didn't gesture. He simply turned back to the audience, gave a single nod, and stepped back from center stage. The camera operator didn't cut. No direction was given, they just kept rolling, as if the machines understood instinctively that nothing should be interrupted now. The feed of the crowd outside panned wider. Candles flickered under streetlights. Cars passed slowly without honking. Even traffic seemed to know something sacred was happening. Bill wiped a hand across his mouth, then looked at Amelia. "Do I say something?" he asked, almost pleading. Amelia didn't answer him directly. Instead, she looked to the screen and said, "Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is nothing at all." Bill stared at her, then lowered his gaze, and said nothing. Outside, the wind moved gently through the signs, rustling the edges of words like "truth still matters" and "we're done being silent." Inside, the silence was no longer awkward. It was deserved. It was earned. And it wasn't Keanu's voice that left the final impression. It was the absence of noise, proof that some moments are too important to be scripted. They just have to be witnessed. The next morning, the world was not the same. By sunrise, news outlets had shifted their headlines. The takedown that was supposed to define Keanu Reeves' downfall had become something else entirely, something no network had scripted and no producer had planned. Every major channel was covering the moment. Footage from inside the studio played on a loop. The freeze frame of Keanu standing in silence had already become iconic. It appeared on morning news panels, international broadcasts, and even political commentary shows. Analysts didn't know how to frame it. Was it protest? Was it exposure? Was it the beginning of something larger? The public didn't wait for a definition. They gave it one. Hashtags flooded the internet within hours. Let us speak. Keanu was right. Silence is power. End quote. Operation Ice Bath. Some were angry. Others were reflective. But all of them shared a common pulse. People had seen something true, and they couldn't let it go. Meanwhile, Keanu said nothing. No statement, no press conference, no tweet. He simply vanished from the spotlight, as he often did when the noise grew too loud, not to retreat, but to make room for something else. That morning, while social media erupted and cable news scrambled for talking heads, Keanu sat quietly in a small cafe tucked between two bookstores on a quiet street. Across from him sat Amelia, her usual calm still intact, but her eyes carrying the fatigue of someone who had held back a tidal wave and was still standing. The cafe was half empty. No one bothered them. If anyone recognized Keanu, they gave him space. Maybe they understood now that attention wasn't what he needed. Amelia sipped her coffee slowly and glanced at her tablet. They're calling it the most important unscripted moment on live television in a decade. Keanu stirred his coffee once, then set the spoon down. I didn't want a moment, he said. I know, she replied, but sometimes the truth chooses you. Keanu nodded slightly, then said only 4 words. Let the truth talk. Amelia smiled faintly and didn't press further. She knew better than anyone what had happened the night before didn't require spin. It didn't need a campaign. It was already echoing. At that exact moment, across the city, Laya sat cross-legged on her small apartment floor, recording a video on her phone. She hadn't slept. Her hands still shook, but her voice was firm. In the background was her open laptop, where a dozen open tabs showed coverage of the story. She didn't read from a script. She didn't edit. She just spoke. I was a part of the team that tried to set up Keanu Reeves, she began. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't think I had a choice. She blinked hard, keeping tears from falling. They told us he was going to be difficult, that he would dodge questions, that he needed to be neutralized with subtle disruption. I thought that was just talk, but it wasn't. They planned it. Every beat, every technical error, every manipulated moment. She held up her badge. I'm not proud of what I was part of, but I'm proud I finally said something. The video was 3 minutes long. By noon, it had 10 million views. Laya's video hit the internet like a match to dry paper. It wasn't flashy. There were no filters, no trending music, no branding in the corners of the frame. Just her badge, and a trembling voice telling the truth. That rawness made it more powerful than any polished broadcast ever could. People didn't just watch it, they shared it. Then they commented. Then they added their own stories. The comment sections beneath her video began to swell with something bigger than support. They became testimony. I lost my job for speaking up about unsafe conditions at my school. My editor pulled my article because it made the wrong politician look bad. I was told to rewrite my statement or risk being dropped from the panel, so I stayed quiet. I've regretted it every day since. There were thousands, then tens of thousands, all variations of the same theme. People who had been silenced, edited, erased, not by force, but by pressure, by optics, by institutions that feared truth more than scandal. The hashtag Let Us Speak became the fastest-growing social tag of the month, not just in English, in French, in Spanish, in Korean, in Arabic. The words translated differently, the feeling did not. What started as a media scandal had shifted. It wasn't about Bill Maher anymore. It wasn't even about Keanu. It was about voice. It was about the systems built to manage truth like a commodity, and the people ready to reclaim it. Back in the cafe, Amelia turned her tablet toward Keanu. On screen, she showed him Leia's video, already picked up by the Associated Press, Reuters, and BBC. She did it, Amelia said. She told the world. Keanu watched the screen in silence, his expression unreadable. When the video ended, he looked out the window. Belly always assumes silence is weakness, he said quietly. Until it becomes a mirror, Amelia added. Keanu didn't smile, he just nodded. They didn't speak for a while. The cafe remained quiet, insulated from the roar outside. And yet the energy was there, humming just beyond the glass. A city shifting under its own realization. Keanu finally finished his coffee, set the cup down. "I'm not going to speak publicly," he said. Amelia met his eyes. "You don't need to," she said. "They're doing it for you." And they were. By evening, college professors were assigning essays about the ethics of media manipulation. Churches were referencing the moment in sermons about courage and stillness. Union organizers shared clips of Keanu's silence in training sessions on how to respond when provoked. Everywhere, people were asking the same question. What would I do if they cut my mic? And the answer wasn't shout louder. It was, be ready, stay calm, and trust that the truth doesn't need volume, it needs presence. Keanu didn't attend any rallies. He didn't film a follow-up statement. He didn't sign a book deal or accept interviews. He just kept showing up quietly, wherever people were still willing to listen. Because the moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to anyone who had ever been silenced and now felt a little less alone. And that morning, for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of voices. By the end of the week, the story had stopped being a headline. It had become a case study. What began as a tense television segment had unraveled into a full-scale institutional collapse. Not because of one mistake, not because of a misunderstood comment or a technical error, but because the entire structure had been designed to deceive. It started with leaked internal emails, dozens of them, then hundreds, screenshots, transcripts, staff memos. They weren't rumors. They were records, and they painted a picture far worse than anyone had imagined. The planning behind the broadcast hadn't come from a few rogue producers or a single offhand strategy. It had been greenlit at the top. Senior executives had reviewed outlines that used words like containment, public framing, and risk management. Legal advisors had signed off on contingency plans to suppress any off-script response. They knew exactly what they were doing, and worse. They had prepared for the fallout. What they hadn't prepared for was accountability. The first blow came when a coalition of civil rights lawyers filed a class action lawsuit, not on behalf of Keanu, but on behalf of the audience. The claim was simple. The show had sold itself as open discourse while deliberately deceiving viewers. People had tuned in for an honest conversation and received a manipulated performance disguised as journalism. In legal terms, it was misrepresentation. In public terms, it was betrayal. The plaintiffs weren't seeking money. They were seeking reform, and the public was behind them. Colleges and universities across the country began hosting emergency panels. Professors from media ethics, communications, and political science departments convened in lecture halls to unpack what had just happened. Some classes used the video as core material. Others made it the focus of semester-end projects. The Keanu event, as some began calling it, had become a turning point, one that forced an entire industry to look inward. And the industry was bleeding. The network that aired the show lost 7 sponsors in 3 days. Viewer trust ratings plummeted. Social media sentiment dropped below crisis levels. Then came the internal memo that leaked to staff. Effective immediately, Bill Maher will not appear on the next episode of his show. No further comment. It didn't read like a decision. It read like damage control. Inside the studio, morale collapsed. Producers began calling out sick. Interns quit mid-shift. Scripts were pulled, reworded, stripped of anything remotely controversial. The control room, once the heartbeat of the show, now ran on whispers and apologies. Amid it all, Keanu remained silent. No press release, no interviews, no book deal, no podcast appearance. He didn't gloat. He didn't strike back. He simply let the system answer for itself. That silence, once considered passive, now spoke louder than any monologue ever could. It wasn't retreat. It was discipline. And it reminded people what real strength looks like when power is crumbling. But even in silence, Keanu wasn't idle. He had been working with Amelia, quietly, on one final message. Of not to the network, not to the show, but to the people. The message wasn't flashy. It wasn't produced by a major media company. It didn't air during prime time or go out with a corporate logo attached. It was posted on a simple page, a blank white background, one short paragraph at the top, followed by a single embedded video. No autoplay, no ads, just a message. The text read, "If you've ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or stop asking questions, this is for you. We heard you. We see you. You're not alone." The video opened with stillness, no music, no graphics. Just Keanu, seated on a wooden bench outside a public library, wearing a hoodie, hands folded. He looked directly into the camera. Not intensely, just on. His voice came softly. "You've heard enough words over the last few days, so this won't be a long speech." He paused. "I didn't come on that show to expose anyone. I didn't go there to start something. But the truth has a way of showing up when you refuse to abandon it." Another pause, this one longer. "I'm not going to tell you how to feel. I'm not going to ask you to fight. All I ask is that you pay attention to the moments when something doesn't sit right, to the tone behind the question, to the silence after the mic cuts out." His voice never rose, but it carried weight. Because freedom isn't loud. It's not chaos. It's not rage. Sometimes it's the quietest voice in the room that holds the line. He looked off camera for a brief second, then back. "I didn't speak so you'd listen to me. I spoke so you'd remember you still can." The video ended there. No title card, no outro, just a few seconds of natural background sound. Wind, birds, a car passing. That was it. And it went viral. Not for its drama, not for its flash, but for its stillness. The comments poured in from around the world. This made me cry in my car. I showed this to my daughter. She's been scared to speak up in school. Now she's not. I'm a journalist. I lost my job last year. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. The final message didn't reopen wounds. It closed something gently. It gave the moment a kind of punctuation no courtroom could deliver. Back inside the collapsing network, executives tried to reframe. Some floated new programming ideas. Others pitched panel discussions on free speech. But no one was listening, because the power had shifted, and not to another celebrity or network, to the people watching, to those who had waited too long to be heard. In universities, classrooms discussed the ethics of editing. In community centers, organizers printed signs reading, "Let us speak," for town halls. In boardrooms, companies rewrote their crisis playbooks. And in homes, conversations were happening that hadn't happened in years. Honest, uncomfortable, necessary conversations. Keanu never followed up on the video. He didn't need to, because the message wasn't about him. It was about what happens when a system built to mute people forgets that silence, too, can be revolutionary. And when truth walks into a room, it doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just sits down and stays. 2 weeks after the broadcast that shook the foundation of televised media, Keanu Reeves made his first appearance. Not on a network, not on a stage, and not with any public fanfare. No press tour, no interviews, no spotlight. He reappeared in a modest live stream hosted by a non-profit organization called The Table. There were no promotional posters, no countdown clocks or viral teasers, just a quiet notice that appeared on a few independent news blogs and online discussion forums. Join us for a conversation at the table. No applause, no edits, just truth. The live stream began with the camera focused on a large wooden table in the center of a softly lit community center room. 10 people sat around it. No titles, no introductions, just faces from all walks of life. A middle school teacher, a construction worker, a refugee advocate, a young mother, a small business owner, a retired veteran, an artist, a bus driver, a nursing student. And at the far end of the table, sitting with his hands folded, was Keanu Reeves. There were no hosts, no moderators wearing earpieces, just a quiet voice that welcomed the audience. This is not a debate. This is not a program. This is a room. And we've come to sit in it, not to win, but to understand. The first question came from a retired social worker. What gave you the strength to stay so calm when the world was trying to twist your words? Keanu didn't rush the answer. He leaned forward slightly and met her eyes. Courage isn't being right, he said. It's being honest when it costs you everything. And sometimes, staying calm is the only way to stay honest. The words didn't land with applause. They landed with stillness. Everyone at the table sat with it, nodding, letting the meaning unfold on its own time. One by one, others began to speak. The young mother described being told to soften her story during a local news interview about domestic abuse shelters. The artist shared how his public gallery was quietly pulled after a piece criticized corporate ownership in the arts. The veteran admitted he had gone silent for years, afraid his story would be weaponized, distorted, or made political. Keanu didn't interrupt. He didn't guide. He listened. When he did speak, it wasn't to explain, it was to reflect. You're not alone, he said. That's what they make you think. That when you're censored, it's because you're wrong. But most of the time, it's because you're inconvenient. The live stream wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic angles or edited inserts. The audio was clean. The frame never cut away. It lasted for an hour and 21 minutes. By the end of the stream, over 3 million people had tuned in. But the number that mattered more, 78,000 people signed up to join the platform hosting the event. They didn't sign up to follow Keanu. They signed up to participate. The platform was called The Table, and it wasn't built to go viral. It was built to be open. The Table wasn't like other platforms. It didn't ask users to follow. It didn't show trending topics. It didn't reward likes or shares. Instead, it posed a single question to every participant who joined. What do you need to say that no one has let you say yet? And it offered a chair, figuratively, and in some cases, literally. Each digital conversation was shaped like a table. 10 participants per thread. No creator in the center. No upvoting. Just people. Talking. A middle school student in Kentucky started a thread titled, "They called me a disruption for asking why we didn't cover slavery until November." A journalist from Istanbul posted, "I used to write stories. Now I write safe summaries. How did that happen?" A nurse from Lagos wrote, "I was told not to mention the lack of equipment at our hospital. I want to ask others, what happens when ethics cost your job?" There were no trolls, no anonymous attacks, Moderators didn't censor unpopular opinions, they only removed cruelty. And at the top of every table, every single thread was the same quote in quiet gray text. "Don't wait to be silenced to realize you mattered." Keanu Reeves. The site wasn't credited to Keanu. In fact, when asked by a participant during a follow-up live stream whether he founded the table, Keanu simply shook his head. "It's not mine," he said. "It's all of ours. That's the point. You can't build a place for voice and then put one person in charge of who gets heard." That live stream didn't feature any celebrities, just a college professor, a community organizer, a delivery driver, and a teenager who had recently lost her debate team spot after refusing to read a rewritten prompt. They asked Keanu, "Why stay involved if you've already proven your point?" He answered softly, "Because if the people who aren't afraid don't stay, the ones who are still finding their voice might think it's safer to stay silent." Those words traveled far. Screenshots of the quote were printed and posted on school walls, community bulletin boards, inside break rooms, in union halls, even on bookmarks at public libraries. Universities began designing courses titled The Table Method, teaching communication based on mutual presence, not persuasion. Churches began holding table nights. No sermons, just shared stories. Mental health groups started digital circles for teens who had been labeled too intense, too political, or too sensitive to be taken seriously. And Keanu? He continued showing up, quietly, sometimes under his name, sometimes not. He didn't offer solutions. He asked questions. And more importantly, he listened. When asked what his future goals were for the table, he gave a now famous answer. "No goals, just more chairs." That phrase was etched into a mural at the center's wall where the first stream was filmed. It became the platform's signature. Not a product, not a movement, a place. By the end of the first month, the table had grown to over 1.5 million participants in 47 countries. Still no advertisements, still no leaders, just people, not louder, but freer. And that, Keanu often said in closing each quiet stream, was enough. The world didn't change in one night. But in the days and weeks that followed Keanu Reeves's quiet stand, something undeniable began to shift. It started in classrooms. High school teachers who once avoided controversial topics began assigning essays titled, "What Does It Mean to Speak Freely?" Students who used to stay quiet in fear of being labeled defiant were finally being asked what they thought, not what they were supposed to think. In one rural school district, a language arts teacher created a new assignment. Students had to watch the full, unedited version of the broadcast, then write a response, not to the controversy, but to the silence. What did it mean, she asked them. Not the words, the silence. In a classroom in Chicago, a student stood up after reading his essay and said, "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm being graded on how safe I sound." The ripple extended far beyond schools. In city parks and small towns, people began gathering, not for protests, not for rallies, but for something older and simpler: conversation. Circles formed under trees, in libraries, in open cafes, where strangers sat together to talk about censorship, power, integrity, and fear. Some groups called it table talks. Others didn't give it a name at all. There were no mics, no camera crews, just chairs, and people who had realized they were more alike in their silence than they were different in their opinions. Meanwhile, in offices of major media networks, a quiet shuffle was underway. Producers who had once championed ratings over reality began stepping down, not with dramatic headlines, but with resignation letters that read like reflections. "I forgot what I was supposed to protect. I compromised truth for convenience. This isn't why I got into journalism." It didn't happen all at once, but it happened. One by one, the old guard of media, the ones who built shows not on truth, but on control, began disappearing from the frame. And in the center of all that change was Keanu, or rather, the absence of him. He didn't speak out further. He didn't write a book or appear on a magazine cover. He didn't claim victory. He simply faded, just enough for others to step forward. Yet he didn't disappear completely. One photo surfaced online weeks after the movement reached its peak. It showed Bill Maher walking alone through a narrow street in Santa Monica. No entourage, no camera crew, no suit. Just a weathered jacket, headphones in, eyes down. The photo went viral. Not for mockery, for curiosity. What does a man do when he's no longer the center of the conversation? When asked about the image during a private roundtable at the table, someone posed the question to Keanu, "Do you feel vindicated? Do you think he got what he deserved?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I don't want anyone to break," he said. "I hope he's healing." That sentence, so simple, so disarming, was enough to bring the room to stillness. Because it was never about vengeance. It was about clarity. And the moment people realized that, even the ones who initially didn't understand, the movement changed from resistance to renewal. In a world driven by noise, it was the absence of shouting that struck deepest. That's what people remembered. Not the confrontation, not the failure of a show, not the collapse of an empire. They remembered the pause, the stillness, the look in Keanu's eyes when he said nothing and meant everything. A high school senior wrote in her college essay, "I didn't know you could win with silence until I watched that moment." A father in Idaho told his son, "You don't have to yell to be strong. You just have to know when not to leave the room." A woman in Spain wrote on the table, "For the first time in my life, I felt spoken to without being spoken over." Those weren't headlines, they were human echoes. And the story didn't end with policy changes or media retractions. It ended, if you could call it that, with a quiet reminder. One evening, a new page appeared on the table's homepage. Not an update, not a new feature, just 5 words. "This space was always yours." Below it was a slow scroll of stories shared by users. Names like Leia, the young production assistant who had once feared the wrath of her employers, now mentoring students on ethical media. A former producer who had quit the network after the scandal, now launching a non-profit dedicated to media transparency. A teenager in Poland who translated Keanu's final live stream into 3 languages to be shared across local schools. People who were once made to feel replaceable had now become irreplaceable. And at the bottom of the page, beneath the quotes and confessions, a single question stood. If they turned the cameras on you, what would you do? That line became more than a reflection. It became a challenge, a dare to stay present when it would be easier to disappear, a call to speak without screaming, to listen without agreeing, to hold space, not just for your voice, but for someone else's. And so now it comes to you. You, the one who has watched this story unfold from beginning to end, the one who maybe cheered or cried or stayed quietly stunned as the world cracked open on live television. The one who didn't know whether to laugh or rage or simply sit with it. What would you do if they turned the cameras on you? Would you play along? Would you freeze? Or would you, like Keanu, stand calm in the fire, not to provoke, but to reveal? Would you be ready not with an answer, but with integrity? Because the truth is, you don't need a camera crew to be seen. You don't need a stage to matter. And you don't need permission to speak. You only need the courage to do it, especially when someone hopes you won't. So if this story stirred something in you, even for a second, let it move, let it ripple, let it be heard. And if you believe that truth should never be scripted, never rehearsed, never hidden behind production value or polite censorship, drop a 9 in the comments. Let the silence speak for itself. No music will play, no banner will drop, just the sound of a moment that mattered, and the choice to never be quiet again.